Okay, I guess the moment when I became really interested in the design of public life was probably the moment when I heard this fact or kind of proverb as an architecture student. And I guess it made me wonder how architects have so little influence over so much of the built environment. Frank Gehry has another way of saying it. And of course, in this context, Gehry is arguing that he's one of a very small number of people who every now and then come along to do something very special, and that we should leave him alone and leave him in peace to get on with his special business. Rather than retreat into this special place, my instinct on hearing that fact was the opposite. I wanted to see how architectural thinking could help improve or work with the dirty reality of normality, or in Gehry's words, making something a bit less shit. So it seemed to me, having worked in a few practices, that the more important decisions about the built environment that were being made, the less architectural intelligence was going into making them. So a lot of the most important decisions were tending to happen before an architect even picked up a phone to receive a commission. If you take a typical development site in London, what's needed is determined to some extent by the NPPF, how much by the London plan, what uses go on a site by the local plan, where it is by a process of land assembly, when it happens by investors, the level of quality by a viability calculation, who it's for through market testing, who designs it through a process of procurement, how big it is by a planning appraisal. Engineering might set the design constraints, and only then might you get to a point where an architect gets involved. Of course, not every project's like this, but it felt that once you then went through the process of cost engineering and construction, an architect's sphere of influence was a small a period in the real lifespan of a building. And I was interested in swimming upstream, in joining the public sector to try and influence some of those important decisions that were being made before architects get involved. So this is my old desk at Croydon Council, and I worked there for 5 years, and I still remember my induction session. And we had an icebreaker exercise where the person next to me asked me what I'd been doing before, and I explained I'd been working for an architect, Rem Koolhaas, and they looked at me as if to say, well, you can't be a very good architect if you've ended up at Croydon Council. And then, you know, they asked me where I commuted in from, and I explained I commuted from Hackney, and they just had this look of pity on my face. I couldn't even get a job in Hackney Council. I'd had to come all the way to Croydon to work for a council. And that stuck with me, because why should public service be seen as a last resort? How can something go from being a privilege to being a punchline? And what effect is that having on our built environment? In Croydon, I was lucky enough to be in an extraordinary placemaking team with very talented colleagues like Vincent Lacavara. And me and Vinny thought about that team a bit like running our own small architecture practice, except that we had a sort of guaranteed flow of work, except that we could make decisions for genuinely sort of public reasons or public good as opposed to private profit, except that we could work across disciplines with colleagues in housing, transport, parking, and except that we had the luxury of long-term involvement in a single place and with the people of that place. After 5 years, we'd secured about £75 million worth of public funding through writing good bids for all kinds of public realm and public infrastructure projects. This bridge by Hawkins Brown and Studio Egro West. We'd got developer contributions for links like this landscape by Muff, which is shown here, new crossings by landscape architects Okra, all small moves, but things that made a radical difference to the town centre. Meanwhile uses, these cricket nets, again by Muff, temporary events in abandoned multi-storey car parks, this one run by the decorators, pop-up food markets that work together with our existing markets and help them thrive, down through to even like sort of crazy golf courses designed by local artists and curated by Turf Projects, a local curator. stages for the community, a stage for the community in New Addington, this one by Assemble, their first permanent commission, deculverting the River Wandle, and we also commissioned public buildings and worked with our colleagues in education to rethink what a porter cabin could be. This is a porter cabin designed by Doug and Morris, another school extension designed by Doug and Morris, award-winning school by Hayhurst & Co., another school by Hayhurst & Co., and a public library, Thornton Heath Library, by FAT. On the other hand, we were also negotiating schemes, and this is one of those schemes. This is the Westfield and Hammerson application for the Whitgift Centre, probably the biggest scheme I dealt with. Took up about 3 years of my time there, but we were also negotiating everything down to householder extensions, and in many ways, some of our biggest successes are things that never happened. A scheme that this was proposed, and through a couple of months of negotiation, got it looking something like this that worked better with the context, worked better for the place. Still a big scheme, but it was better than the other way around, I think. So through all this process, we did start to get a bit of a name for ourselves. I guess it's an unusual thing to have that level of resource in a council nowadays in the current financial climates. And we got asked to pose for embarrassing photo shoots on car park rooftops. And I get, at this stage, it felt like Croydon was going to have a great team, whether I was there or not, but I was interested in how you could grow this sort of culture in other councils that didn't necessarily have the conditions already there. So slightly hypocritically, I left a council and joined the GLA, City Hall. And one of the first things I did there was look at what kind of resources are out there in London. And we did a survey of resources. And this is only a partial picture of resources across London, but it shows the massive disparity in capacity there is when it comes to placemaking, planning, urban design. And when you compare that to the level of growth anticipated in those places, and a crude measure of growth, housing numbers, and then overlay them, you realise that there are massive disparities, gaps. It's a hugely uneven landscape in terms of local authority resourcing, and there's a role for trying to support local authorities to do the really important work they do. So on the back of the Farrell Review, I've independently put forward a proposal to develop a new not-for-profit placement programme to attract Britain's most talented designers to work within councils for the public good, but crucially on their own terms. This is really about putting design back into public service. So I'm not going to go into this now, we can perhaps discuss it later, but the overall impact of what I hope this programme will do is getting the public sector delivering again. And if you look at housing delivery since the war, you can see that the private market has delivered roughly, since the 60s, about 100,000 homes a year. Housing associations have increased their delivery up to about 20,000 homes a year. Local authorities made the biggest difference in terms of producing about half of all our homes until the late 70s and in particular 1979. And I guess what's interesting for me is if you map that against one measure of local authority capacity, the amount of architects who work for the public sector, you see that when we were building enough homes, when the public sector was building half our homes, half of all architects work for the public sector. Now that figure is certainly less than 5%. And I guess the intention of public service is to try and flip that diagram. To support public service, and I guess to try and get away some of the ideas behind the initiative, get out the ideas behind the initiative, and generate some modest funding, I couldn't resist making a series of for football scarves for supporters of political ideas, which, funnily enough, are actually available in the building somewhere as part of the civic shop. So ideas like affordable housing, equality, public transport, or the welfare state. So if public service was about attracting a brilliant new generation of designers into local authorities, this other initiative, NOVUS, is about giving the brilliant people already working within councils a stronger voice at a national level. Now, nearly everyone I know who worked at Croydon, who works for councils, joined councils for all the right reasons. But too often all that civic energy, ambition and creativity has nowhere to go. It gets suffocated by hierarchies, ground down by procedures, processes, discouraged by risk aversion. And NOVUS is a think tank to run exclusively by young public sector planners. You have to have .gov.uk at the end of your email to even be part of it. And we now have over 110 members from across England, and we meet regularly not to talk shop, but to take on and collaboratively draft papers about what we call the elephants in the room of the planning establishment, things like council housing or who decides the city, and this is a paper we've released recently. I just want to end by reading out our manifesto. We've chosen to work for the public to make a real difference. This is our chorus, calling for a bolder future for public planning. We believe in making the fairest decisions for all, not the most profitable decisions for a few. We want the public sector to attract the best talent. We want working for the public sector to be seen as a privilege. That's why only public servants can join NOVUS. We have our ears to the ground. Our thinking is based on experience of the way things really are, not a theoretical ideal of the way things ought to be. We write for the public, not the profession, and we say what we need to say, no more. Each document we produce will be a piece of paper, literally one A4 piece of paper. Our greatest achievements are as much about what doesn't happen as what does. We will make our successes seen. Bureaucracy done badly is a barrier, but done well, it's the foundation of fairness. We want to reclaim bureaucracy as a positive force for equality. Denying that planning can be creative will deny us of creative planners. We believe that planning is about more than saying yes or no. Public planning only works when the public plan. We believe in giving citizens the knowledge and tools to shape their environment. Sustainable decisions aren't made right here, right now. Our idea of here needs to be bigger than the red line on a plan. Our sense of now needs to be longer than the next quarterly report. The public sector is a rare breed of institution that can think and act sustainably. That's it. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. I'd like to start by saying about this image. As practicing architects, we think about architecture as a silent language that speaks. And buildings give out auras or messages, and these can be welcoming or defensive. And what we really enjoy about this image is that the integration of the seed into the stone facade somehow turns a building inside out. What could be defensive and solid becomes welcoming, becomes a kind of place for people to enjoy public space. And we think a lot about and talk a lot about what we call thresholds. And Finn just said that architects, he won't be using jargon, so I don't want to use jargon, but it's an important word because in architecture, probably one of the key moments is that moment where you pass from outside space into inside space. And the way that one manipulates that moment, that threshold, again, is either the thing that obstructs the public or invites the public. And it's not just about how one designs form, but it's also almost to do with temperature, with shadow. The threshold, if it is a rich threshold between inside and outside, it can actually engender public use. We all know that we like to sit in the shade in hot climate and sit in the sun in a cold climate. So it's very much to do with how we make buildings that speak and that welcome the public. And of course, there's also the intention in our work to try to connect the inside out. In University Building in Toulouse, which this is, we make this brick building. It's a brick city. And we stack public rooms and make huge windows between the public rooms through which the professors and the students can connect with their city. And we've made a kind of collage of public elements which exist in Toulouse, like these sky cloister, we call it, and colonnades and terraces and courtyards which open to the sky. And so it's a kind of lesson. Going to Toulouse was a lesson for us in how public space is made, and we tried to take this lesson and integrate it into a building. Fulvio Irace writes very beautifully about Milan. And we really like this quote where he talks about the facades of buildings, the message that a facade can give, and that it describes the moods, the manners, the most secret thoughts of their time. And I won't speak about these buildings, but Milan, I suppose for us, has been a huge lesson. And doing the Bocconi University, probably the main move for us was to think about how the citizen would view the university. This is a not very pretty street, very foggy evening. And the main move was to make the big public room, which is an auditorium, that it feels like a boulder which erupts out of the ground. Milan is a very solid city. It's quite hard on the outside with very rich interiors. And so we felt by splitting the solid block open, it's almost a kind of a violent act in a sense. But what it does is it makes a void, and it gives a sense of waiting. Alejandro de la Sota said that architects should make as much nothing as possible. And by that, we understand that to mean that the nothing as possible is the void where things happen, the void where public space can happen. And we use structure and scale as a way of making space which invites occupation. There's something about the force of gravity, or the feeling weight being borne down or lifted up, that somehow lifts the human spirit. And so we try to make spaces which invite occupation, but which also make a kind of sense of people being part of a larger social order. And by inviting the public into the university, we also really felt it was important to make a connection with the city, so that we were blurring the boundaries between inside and outside, and really thinking about public space as being the primary component around which the world of the university could operate. And it's interesting the way this window to Milan attracts the visitor. We're very interested in Barbara Ehrenreich, who wrote a beautiful book called Dancing in the Streets, and she talks about the difference between individual happiness and collective joy, and that the industrial society has somehow repressed the sense of collective joy, or occasions where collective joy can happen. And I suppose the role of the architect is to make spaces which bring people together, and to make that sense of community. And we really like this photograph because these people can't get into something that's happening inside of Bocconi. And just going back to the language that speaks, in this window, which is reflected across the street from the corner you've just seen, lives a 90-year-old woman who very kindly allowed the person photographing the building over the 4 years of construction to use this window to photograph. And he asked us on the day of the opening if we'd like to meet her. We went and we met her, and it was very nice, and we asked her if she would like to come and see the building, and she said no, she didn't think she would like it. So she said fine, and then she changed her mind and she came with us. And as we walked through the building, she came down into these spaces and she said, these spaces are enormous. Questo spazio è enorme ma mi abbraccia. This space is enormous, but it embraces me. And we felt that was a real revelation for us in terms of how spaces can actually, not a revelation, but a reminder of how important space is, and in terms of how it makes people feel. I suppose this image is to do with the idea of city as theatre. In Italy, there was a fantastic conference I attended where theatre directors were talking about the history of theatre, especially in Venice, and the shock that came when a door was made into the theatre, because the theatre was always open, and that the perception of theatre changed when the door happened. And I found that really something really sobering to think about what doors mean, and I suppose it's also to do with the theme that's being discussed this evening, how one invites people into a building. We've been attracted by the work of South American architects for quite some time, and this image of the underside of a floating museum in Sao Paulo, designed by an Italian architect, Lina Bobardi, where she made the building float over the public space of the city in order to make a kind of belvedere. And that project really inspired us and helped us in the making of the Bocconi University. What's fascinating about architects, especially around the 60s and in South America, is that even in very repressive regimes, they still seem to manage to make space which has a real sense of the civic and the public. There's always the connection with the city. They use structure and climate and, of course, culture, which is different to ours. But somehow we've always felt that there was a real lesson here in the sense of the priority or the agenda of the architect being that connection was primary. The openness and the inclusiveness and the making of civic space always appears to us in these projects to be the primary role. And for the Venice Biennale 2012, we celebrated this influence by celebrating the work of Paulo Mendes de Rocha from Sao Paulo, because we shared a philosophy with him, which was that architecture is new geography. And he describes Venice as being the capital of the capital of the imagined world. And we really liked that description because he talks about it being about making territory, not about making buildings, but about making new territory. So when we won this competition for a new university in Lima, we found ourselves, I suppose, somewhat equipped for it, because we had for, I suppose, about 10 years prior to that been looking at this South American work. And Lima is a city which is about 11 million people, very poor public transport, has this amazing fog and this very surreal situation where the city disappears into the fog because it's at a point where there's a meeting of two currents. So sometimes the city is gone and then sometimes the city is there. And I suppose this project really tested and made us really think about this idea of architecture as new geography, and also to really explore what the particular climate and culture would allow us to do in terms of making a university as a public space. We made this building feel like a kind of man-made cliff, and because of the shape of the building, a big motorway and gentle residential area, it started to look like a kind of arena, so we called it an arena for learning. Just to describe the cascading gardens made by cascading classroom spaces, and this sort of shoulder space which offers protection from the motorway. So it's a kind of three-dimensional social infrastructure. All the circulation is open, it's a moderate climate, and the only internal rooms are the teaching spaces. And again, I suppose it is about making new territory. It's a vertical university on a very tight site, so it is a kind of new geography. And by virtue of the climate and the culture, we were really able to explore. In Toulouse, the circulation is open also, and somewhat in Milan. And in Lima, is completely open. And there's something, I suppose, that thing of not having boundaries is so liberating. And again, what we felt was important was the students would always be connected with the city. So the nose of the building faces the Pacific Ocean, and the students always overlook their place. The building disappears into the fog when it descends. And the kind of social infrastructure or the educational infrastructure announces the arrival of this new institution in the city on the motorway. These are all it's almost finished, the galleries and terraces and gardens integrated into this kind of viaduct or aqueduct type structure. And the ends of these galleries make these big eyes to the Pacific Ocean. And this is also the kind of nostril, because the wind comes from the Pacific Ocean and flows through the building. I just wanted to talk a minute, and maybe it touches a little on what Finn was speaking about, but the importance of patronage and who it is that's commissioning architecture, and it's a crucial thing, and that in all of the projects where we've managed to make what we feel good projects, we've had a patron, not a patron in terms of money, but a patron in terms of a vision for the building and support for the building. The building in Lima has been an extraordinary experience for us. It's built by a mining engineer, a new university funded by a mining engineer with some colleagues. His father was a philanthropist and set up a technical college in Lima, and his ambition is to make it one of the best engineering universities in South America. But it's interesting that it's mining engineers combined with education. What we also found interesting is the School of Engineering has a cinema, a theatre with a fly tower, exhibition space, and all the students will have lessons or courses in art because they believe in the roundedness of education, and we found that fascinating. What was also interesting was that they speak very passionately about geology because they buy mountains and they have to find seams where there's silver and gold, and they talk about dreaming geology. And their dream is to make this, is to make this university. And somehow by an act of both fate and faith, we found ourselves together with them making something which feels like a piece of geology. This is looking towards the motorway, and we make these gardens embedded in the structure. And as I say, it's not finished, but you see the sense of the bridges and the staircases and the terraces integrated into the infrastructure. And there's something also about dealing with climatic control. The sun comes from the north, and so we made this kind of corbelled space in order that direct sunlight would never enter into the space. So you're at first floor level looking up to the sky, but you don't see the sky because we were making protection from the sun. And something extraordinary kind of happens because a very porous structure suddenly feels very solid. And by virtue of not seeing the sky, it feels like you're in a kind of cathedral space or a fissure or a crack in an urban block. And the students have just started to occupy this space. And it's in a city which is full of armed guards and gates and fences. This university will be open to the local community. They want the local community to use the building, to use the theatre, to use the cinema. And it's kind of turning things inside out in a sense. I suppose it's a sense of optimism after the long period of terror that they had in Lima. So I suppose in terms of the theme we've been asked to discuss, we see our role as architects, our primary role as architects is the making of civic space. And in terms of the question maybe being asked in the exhibition Civic Futures, we feel we have no future if we don't have a civic future. Thank you.
I thought it was very interesting that we've somehow jumped from the scale of an entire neighbourhood or borough down to the scale of a single bench for the first slide of your presentation. How do you navigate between those scales? How do when you're evaluating a scheme in Croydon or in the City of London, are you looking for that bench as well as the overall massing? And in the way that you deploy your architectural tools, are you constantly flipping between the scale of the whole block, this infrastructural building, and to how it hits the street?
I mean, as a public servant commissioning buildings, you're constantly hoping that you'll be able to employ an architect who has the same, who builds an understanding with you of what a particular brief is, and it sounds like the similar way you've built a relationship, for example, with the client on the last building you showed. But you're looking at their previous work. I mean, as someone with an architectural background, it's extremely tempting to start drawing, and in a way there's a sort of self-imposed rigour you need to have to really create the conditions for great architecture, but not get stuck in yourself, and put the pen away when you want to start working on that too. So Vincent and I, working at Croydon, always talked about the work we did as designing without drawing lines, but we were very conscious. Our job was to create the conditions for architects to come along and really think through a project right down to the levels of detail that Shelley was just talking about. That's when you're talking about buildings. At the same time, I think there's as someone who's looking after a place, actually, we were looking after Croydon for quite a period of time. They still are. You need to be able to read human behaviour down to the level of how people sit and or just how citizens relate to a place with that fineness of detail and observation that Shelley showed. It's just you're not drawing. That's the biggest difference.
I think what you're doing is, I think it's so crucial and so radical and so important, because what you're trying to do is it's almost like a gardener. If you don't have the conditions, things can't grow. And in so many societies, in so many countries, the culture of architecture cannot grow. It can't. And I think what you're doing is generous, because, as you say, you have to hold back, but also it's generous in terms of spirit, and also it has a breadth of thinking where you're bringing analysis together with creativity, and that's incredibly powerful, because it's imagination based on fact, and it's not just it's not self-indulgent. It's the opposite. And that's really important. And I was saying earlier, we've learned an awful lot from Milan, but one of the kind of shocking things that we learned initially was that we went to see an apartment building by an architect who was still alive in his 90s, and this was built in the 60s. And there was an atmosphere about that building, and we couldn't put our finger on it, but we just knew that it was absent in so many contemporary buildings. And we realized that it was a sense of humanism, that it wasn't a narcissistic building. It had a different agenda to what many contemporary buildings have. It just had a beautiful way of entering, and you came down steps, and there was a seat for somebody to sit on while they found their keys or put their shopping bag or meet somebody, and it was a tower. And it's just that thing of understanding the way people use space, what makes people feel good at the level of detail and at the level of the larger scale. So I think you can't separate the two.
I think that's what is really fascinating about your work in particular, Shelley, is that it seems to break all of these rules that we think public buildings or public spaces are meant to have. I mean, thinking of the work of Jan Gehl, for instance, who will promote street trees and cafes, and everything needs to be lined with a fuzzy edge of people sitting there drinking lattes or reading newspapers. Your Milan project presents a glass wall opening onto a sheer drop, and yet this picture of people peering into and seeing the life of the building, it breaks every rule of Christopher Alexander's window seats, and yet it has a life, a public life within the city. And we could say the same about your incredible project in Lima, which has this infrastructural scale, and yet the way you talk about it as a public room seems to transcend that. So it's not, as you say, this tower in Milan can still be human. It's not necessarily about building small and building delicate.
Yeah. Well, we talked about creating the conditions, but you used the word climate, and in many ways, and I think that's a really nice, important way of thinking about it, because obviously there's the climate of specific places that influence the vernacular architecture in a very direct way, whether it's the solidity of walls in colder climates, or the sort of paper-thin architecture you get in Japan, through to the steeply pitched roofs of places with high rainfall. So there's a direct relationship between the climate and its architecture, but of course that climate can be political as well. And I've always been interested in how designing in Northern Europe, in Western Europe, our main advantage is not that we've got a climate that allows us to sit outside in the sun all day, but that we've got a political climate, at least we have done over the last century, that allows a sort of permeability that you showed, or publicness, that is not always available in other places. And for me, the idea that you can work with that climate, we've all got an opportunity to influence that climate on the 7th of May, and that will have a very real result on the architecture of the kind of buildings we create, because it's a different kind of climate that an architect like you can turn into amazing things.
I suppose we believe in the monumentality of architecture, that people love big spaces, and that we shouldn't be afraid of making big spaces if that's what's needed. I mean, we're also interested in making very intimate things. It depends on what you're doing. That was a big university. It needed a big space. It's a lot of people. So it was a big, formidable, it is a big, formidable city. So the character of the building comes out of thinking about the city. But just talking about political climates, I suppose one of the reasons why we won that competition was because we opened up the university and we pulled the public rooms out of the ground, because they were all supposed to be below ground. So by breaking the rules and opening up the building, it opens up what is quite a conservative university of economics to the city. And they wanted that, actually. Sometimes what's interesting about architecture is that people don't know what they want, but they know something when they see it. So they loved the fact that the university would have an opportunity to open up to the city. And I suppose universities are very important institutions, because they're so key to the health of a society, and the attitude of a university to its city is key. Again, from a political point of view. But I think architecture and politics are not so much politics in terms of active politics, but every decision you make as an architect is a political one, in a sense, because you try to put the values of the human being before whatever else it is people are asking you to do, in terms of money or scale or whatever. I mean, that is our role, to make spaces which make people feel good. So it's, and sometimes it's very hard to navigate that sometimes very tiny space that's given to it.
We saw projects from all over the world, really. I mean, you've worked extensively in Milan and now in South America, and also, of course, your home city of Dublin. Finn, you've lived in Rotterdam and Helsinki and concentrated very much in South London. Are there universal rules about what makes a great public space, or does it take time to get to know that culture and the way people operate in order to design for that place?
I don't think there are. I don't think there are universal rules. I think the point you made about the rules of Christopher Alexander or Jan Gehl or any new urbanism being beautifully broken by every project that Shelley showed proves that to some extent. I think there's an approach you can take to cities that Grafton show that can learn from, observe what's already there rather than what you want to put there, and use that as a way of creating public space. But ultimately, the public space is irrelevant without the people of that place, and the people are all different. So I just think you need to get to know the people, whether it's the patron or the users or the 90-year-old woman who lives opposite. They're all part of the specificity of that place, and I don't think there's a recipe that can create that.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's a philosophy that's consistent, but the way of representing that has to be different. It has to connect with what you're doing. And actually, it's very interesting. I saw an exhibition about Paula Mendes de Rocha in the Triennale last summer, and he says quite a radical thing, which is that there's no such thing as private space. There's only different gradations of public space. And he was talking about the house. He doesn't even believe the house to be private, and he thinks it's an extinct type, and that we should be building apartments in cities, and tries to use the apartment as a typology, the house, the private house, as a typology for collective living. And I was reading Walter Benjamin speaking about, writing about Naples recently, and he says a really interesting thing, that in Naples, culturally, people used to, or maybe still do, think about the house as a place you go out from, not a place you retreat to. And there's something very interesting about the need for privacy, and that leads to isolation. And how one gets that balance between private space and public space, even in one's thinking. Because Kenneth Frampton, for instance, says that architects have lost the ability of making spaces which bring people together. That's very sobering. I mean, if that's our role and we've lost the ability, it's something we have to really think about. And I suppose it's not always an architectural problem. It's very often a bureaucracy can be beautiful problem.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, our exhibition and this conversation, of course, is timely in one way. To come back to your capital P politics, we all have an opportunity to help shape that climate in which we operate in, and it happens to be that the climate for public investment, for public architecture, for public building is at a low point at the moment. Finn, with your work, I guess trying to foster a sense of, that somehow being a public servant is not a last resort. Are you more optimistic? Are you hopeful? Can you see some more attention being put into these types of spaces?
Not if you go purely by what's written in any of the manifestos, but certainly if you look at the way that people as a whole are engaging, or younger people particularly are engaging with politics. I think you can sense that there's some kind of acceptance now of almost like a growing coolness of the nerdiness of being caring about the public or being. One sign of this, and it's hard to. This is nowhere a statement of any political allegiance, but I've been really fascinated by this hashtag Millie fandom, because there's an acceptance there that actually Ed Miliband doesn't have to look cool and beautifully styled the whole time and very confident whenever he speaks. That there's a reveling in his nerdiness and geekery that has a certain level of respect from younger people that I think no spin doctor could ever have anticipated. And I think you can see signs of that acceptance of an alternative, more potentially bureaucratic acceptance that bureaucracy isn't necessarily only a bad thing, that younger generations have that I guess older generations find difficult to accept because they've seen so much of the negative side of big bureaucracies. So it's not there yet. It might take generations or elections, a series of elections to play out. But I think that there has, of course, been a massive swing away from the public in terms of investment in public service, in local authorities. And there will become a point where the pendulum has swung too far and it will start swinging back the other way. It just might not be this election, going by what I've read so far.
Just to come back to this point you made a minute ago, Shelley, that there is no private space, it's all a gradation of public. In a moment in the UK when this investment in public architecture is so low, is that your response to it, to make every commission that comes into your office a public one, whether it be a private house or an apartment building or a university, to try and bring into it this generosity that we hope for and expect from a public space?
Yeah, I suppose it depends on how one defines private and public, but it is even in the making of a house, even within the house itself, there's public and private, in a way that the house itself is a microcosm of our needs. You know, there are moments when you need to retreat, and there are moments when you want to engage. So that balance is one of the key things in architecture, whatever kind of building you're designing. But I do think, particularly now, that the priority of making spaces which bring people together is key. And to be able to find mechanisms, whether they're physical or intellectual or economical, to find ways of doing that.
Are there jobs that you say no to because they don't have those fundamental conditions or that climate, the right climate to produce that kind of architecture? Because I certainly if I look at all of the public buildings that are being built in London right now, and I say public purely in terms of use, so new council headquarters, new libraries, they tend to, the model of financing is so fundamental, and the model of ownership is so fundamental to the architecture that you can produce, that perhaps it's that's tying architects' hands and leading Kenneth Frampton to say architects have lost the ability to be public. Certainly in terms of, there's a presumption on all political spectrums at the minute that public buildings shouldn't really look expensive now in Britain at the minute. There's a sort of aesthetic of austerity that we were supposed to impose in all the buildings we commission, and because we can't be seen to be spending money in a generous way. And the same model of care or risk, carefulness or risk is taken when it comes to financing public buildings. Rather than invest in a brand new council headquarters, they'll get a developer to build it and then pay them a rent to move in. Minimum commitment in terms of maximum flexibility, but ultimately you're paying a huge amount every year for a building that you don't own, and you don't even own the public space, or in many cases control the public space around it. It produces a very different kind of town hall than the town halls that we picture when we say, or even city hall that we picture when we say that.
We've never actually refused work on that basis. In fact, we seem to be refused because maybe people think we're trouble. You know, the developers never really commission us ever, even during the Celtic Tiger, because maybe, I don't know, they just thought we would spend too much money or we wouldn't do what we were told or something, I don't know. But we have tried, for instance, to, with some very good Irish architects, to come together to work with schools, you know, at the time that they were being done in these, as happened here in the UK, in these big bundles given over to developers. But again, we never succeeded. So, and I think we have the nerve to try and engage with whatever it is life brings our way. And if the moment comes where somebody is too greedy or too, if a project is squeezed so tight that you can't make anything, perhaps then we would have to seriously think about, is it worth it? Because making a building is very painful, so you have to have some pleasure.
I mean, I mean, the situation you point out, though, Finn, is an incredibly bizarre one when you think about it. I mean, the principles that this museum were built on, for instance, you know, this place, you could never build a museum as opulent as this today, because public buildings, as you say, need to be perceived to be cheap. The irony is that they rarely are very cheap. They're always incredibly expensive, but they need to have this image of austerity, whereas the principle of this place is that by good design can affect you. It can improve you even, and that idea, I think, is very much out of favour. It seems very simplistic and perhaps patronising. But do you think there's something in that? I mean, these public spaces, the generosity of these public spaces, can they be more than just a dignified backdrop to our lives? Can they actually change us? Can they actually affect us?
They can certainly create the space for really significant things to happen that affect us. It's going to come down to personal experiences, and I don't think you can design a public space and go, right, that is going to transform everyone into a better citizen, but it can create opportunities that wouldn't have been there otherwise to do that. And I think it can put you in a different relationship with other people. Certainly when it comes to public buildings, and your building showed that. I'm just thinking of a number of the council headquarters that have been built recently by private developers that councils rent, and they're designed as generic office buildings because, who knows, the council might be cut to such an extent that it has to move out in a few years' time. They don't want to design something all around one particular council, so they design a good generic office building. The council moves into it temporarily, and they move on. But there's none of that specificity or generosity that you picked up in the examples of the buildings you showed. And actually, I think you need to be given the conditions as an architect to really create those moments for it to have an effect on people. This building did that. I find it hard to point to that many public buildings today. I mean, really in the last 5 years that have those conditions.
I do think it's as much to do with the conditions. It is, of course, to do with the budget, but it's as much to do with the conditions. If you're dealing with somebody who doesn't have a lot of money but has a big vision, it's a completely different climate to dealing with somebody who doesn't have a lot of money and is mean of spirit. The vision or the ambition that somebody has for a project is a huge resource. It's a bigger resource than money. And I think it's the meanness of spirit very often that crushes a project.